I hope that there's a lot of places where we can get these kinds of signs up. You know, a barn, a building in downtown somewhere in New Hampshire or Massachusetts, maybe our own piece of property. And Ed Sargent, who did a great job, I think he put this on his pickup truck, or maybe a station wagon, I think. And how he did that, he's an engineering feat to put he had two signs, I think two of these, one on each side. All kinds of creative ways to get this done. Hey, we don't need you. You can go home now. We're all set. And furthermore, anyway, I was getting warmed up too, and in walks our speaker. But anyway, the first tier is general outreach. Pamphlets, little starter kit where you can get, and by the way, these pamphlets, a pamphlet like this deals with one, get us out of the UN, great pamphlet. But what if someone who's only interested in the gun issue? What do we have for that? We have something like this, introducing the UN as the bigger problem. What if you're just pro-life and you're not thinking about the other issues? The UN is the biggest promoter of abortion in the world. There's a little pamphlet for that. What if you're interested in taxes? Well, the UN is trying to build a world tax. What about land issues? What about children, homeschoolers and such? The UN Treaty on the Child and so forth. So these are ways to introduce this bigger picture to our friends. Petitions, bumper stickers. If you don't have a house with it, you can put a billboard. How about a bumper sticker on your car? And by the way, if you do put one on your car, have ammunition, have pamphlets and brochures and books and things ready to do that. Then we have an excellent new videotape, which has just became available, well, actually become available tomorrow. I just ordered a couple. Host this videotape showing in your home. And we have about 5 or 6 other excellent videotapes dealing with the UN specifically. Consider starting and get us out of the UN committee and introducing this to your friends and your neighbors, just in your neighborhood, okay? Books. You need to have the background information. You don't have to be a walking encyclopedia, because some people know everything, but then it doesn't go beyond their mouth, you know, it stays between the ears. We've got this, in fact, I just got this yesterday, and I'm sure we'll be happy to sign it on the way out. Little booklet designed for massive distribution, designed for people who are interested in the right to keep and bear arms. William Jasper's new book, the United Nations Exposed, and I've read almost everything on the UN, published by the JBS, and I thought, well, I can't learn anything else. Well, I was wrong. You can learn something else. And again, we're not walking encyclopedias, but we have to have a frame of knowledge so we can refute the arguments and get people on our side. Well, without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker. And let me say that when I first met him several years ago, 5 or 6, 7, 8 years ago, he was on tour promoting one of his books. And I spent about 2 days with him. And I was telling people, after 2 days with him, it's it's worth 3 college credits. I mean, the man is a fascinating man, a Shakespearean. He even knows about old-time wrestlers. I was amazed that he knew about his old-time wrestlers. So very, very eclectic. Veteran journalist William Norman Grigg exposed the UN's crusade against God and family with his 1995 blockbuster Freedom on the Altar. Now Grigg is back this time with a powerful expose of the world's body's gun control agenda. Will is the senior editor of the New American magazine. He's been to numerous UN conferences, Cairo, New York, I believe, recently, and a number of other ones. And he's probably the foremost expert on the subject of the United Nations. And we're very privileged to have this man working for the society, and writing for the New American. So let's give him a good hearty applause.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That was very gracious. I'm grateful to be with you this evening. The times in which we live are really not all that compatible with punctuality if you're flying. And my voyage from Wisconsin today was really quite an education. I hadn't had an opportunity to fly since Black Tuesday. And it's interesting to see how utterly things have changed. The last time that I was dealing with an environment similar to the one that confronted me at the airports in Appleton, Detroit, and New Hampshire today, quite frankly, was when I was in Cairo. And in 1994, when they had the International Population Control Summit in Cairo, the government of Cairo, which is not all that fastidious about individual rights, not to put too fine a point on it, had deployed armed people on just about every street with more or less the same kind of an attitude that we're seeing now as a result of the attack on our country. Anybody who thinks that the warnings that we have issued over the last 10 or 15 or 20 years about the possibility of America degenerating into a police state, anybody who's skeptical about those warnings really should take a look around and go back and read the back issues of the Review of the News and American Opinion and so forth. When our sense of security and civility were punctured on the 11th of September, people suddenly found themselves desiring security over liberty. And that is a habit of mind that is very hard to shake. And I suspect that as events continue to unfold and as the almost inevitable follow attacks occur, we're going to find that more and more people are going to be interested in cocooning themselves within the supposed security of the garrison state. And that's something against which we need to be on our guard and something we need to condemn at every possible opportunity. Hal had mentioned that I spent some time in Cairo. I went to Cairo and Copenhagen to various UN World Summits, and I've been to the United Nations on a number of occasions to cover conferences. And I happen to blend in very nicely with the sort of people who attend the United Nations, and I like to play their prejudices against them. They just assume that somebody of my complexion is not going to be one of these nasty right-wing isolationists. And I have found that whereas that is something of an advantage for me when I'm in the United Nations trying to solicit sound bites from people in a candid moment, it's not all that much of an advantage as far as air travel is concerned. I earned a number of rather interesting looks today as I was taking my seat on the airplane here from Detroit. People have often asked me what my racial background is. The typical conversation would go something like this: what race are you? I'll say human, obviously. Let's say, what nationality are you? I say, I'm an American, born and bred. I say, oh, you mean my ethnic background? And I'll ask people to guess. And people will guess, heavens, I've been asked if I were Arab or Jew or Basque or Greek, Polynesian, just about anything but Swedish, really. And as it happens, I'm half Mexican and half Irish, which means that you'd be well advised not to make me angry and not to get me drunk. But the point I'm trying to make here in a roundabout and somewhat self-indulgent way is that one of the good things that happened as a result of Black Tuesday is that people are not as hung up right now about such externalities as racial background, ethnic differences, and so forth. We're dropping the hyphens from our designations. We're no longer African Americans, Hispanic Americans, we're Americans. And that's something that we really need to celebrate, something for which we should give thanks to God, and something that we should build upon, and that's a real opportunity. The first reaction that most people had to the Black Tuesday attack was instructive to me. As we were watching those horrifying scenes unfold in real time on television, many people on television and at our office and across the country were saying, obviously, this is an act of war. This has to be an act of state-sponsored terrorism. And I think that that reflects an instinctive understanding that only a government could kill on that order of magnitude. One of the things that has been somewhat lost in the shuffle as a result of Black Tuesday is an appreciation of the fact that the only endeavor in which government consistently outperforms its private sector competition is mass murder. It could be a government, it could be an entity given the protection of the government, like bin Laden's Al-Qaeda criminal syndicate. But the point is, if you want to kill a lot of people in a hurry, it really requires the instrumentality of the state. I try to help people understand the wisdom which is found in one of my favorite passages from St. Augustine's work, The City of God. He said, justice being taken away, what are kingdoms but vast robberies? If governments aren't carrying out the mission of protecting individual rights, individual property, and enforcing the law, then governments become criminal syndicates, but they become spectacularly murderous criminal syndicates. There's a very depressing but very useful book by Rudolph J. Rummel. Professor Rummel is a professor emeritus at the University of Hawaii. He's a political scientist. The book came out 7 years ago. It's entitled Death by Government. And it is a study of something that Professor Rummel calls democide. He coined that word in order to describe a phenomenon unique to modern times, which is the mass murder on an unprecedented scale of populations by government. Democide means murder of people. And it could be genocide, which is the attempt to liquidate an entire race. It could be politicide, which is the effort to wipe out people who are political opponents of a regime. But democide is a very unfortunate reality of our time that has been very capably documented by Dr. Rummel. In his book, Death by Government, he documented that at least, bear in mind, this is the minimum estimate, at least 170 million people were killed during the 20th century by their own governments. In time of peace, the number could be as high as 360 million people. But let's take the lower end of that spectrum of possibilities here as our estimate. 170 million people. There were roughly 5,000 people who were killed when the World Trade Center towers collapsed. In order to duplicate 20th century democide, it would be necessary for 34,000 World Trade Center attacks to take place in order to duplicate the feat of 20th century democide. Government, when it is emancipated from law, becomes the most dangerous thing in the world. That's what R.J. Rummel said in an interview with the Freeman magazine a few years ago. Bear in mind that Professor Rummel is a recovering liberal. He is somebody who was brought up to look upon the state as the agency of temporal salvation for mankind. He was brought up to look upon the state as that which separates humanity from the beasts, that which separates civilized life from barbarism. But what he found was that when governments are emancipated from law, they become more dangerous than the state of nature they're supposed to protect us from. As a matter of fact, he said that total government is the most dangerous thing on earth, far more deadly than war. Now, I don't know if Professor Rummel was ever exposed to G. Edward Griffin's documentary from the 1960s entitled More Deadly Than War, but that is a conclusion that the John Birch Society has been talking about for almost 4 decades now. Total government is much more deadly than war. As it happens, war is also an undertaking of the government. You don't really have corporations going to war. You don't have youth gangs going to war in anything other than a metaphorical sense. That's something that governments do, and that is a way that governments kill people as well. Democide is what I want to speak about tonight in the context of what we are calling the UN's global gun grab. A lot of people who are properly animated about the possibility of losing our right to keep and bear arms have become aware over the last couple of years that the United Nations is the seat of an effort to deprive civilians worldwide, including here in the United States, of the right to keep and bear arms. Many people have lately come to that knowledge. Indeed, the most influential gun rights lobby in the world, the National Rifle Association, came to that realization more or less in 1996, late 1996. Unfortunately, what they chose to do with that realization was they sought and obtained representation as a non-governmental organization at the UN. The problem with this is that a non-governmental organization at the UN essentially pledges to support the purposes and principles of the United Nations, and the status of NGO, officially accredited NGO, can be withdrawn if the group in question is not seen by the United Nations as helping the UN achieve its goals. The UN's goal, of course, is total power over the entire planet. That's not something I think that honorable people in good faith who share the Americanist point of view can subscribe to. The formula for democide contains 3 important parts. The first of which is consolidation of power. That's something which is the desire of every ruling elite in history. Every ruling elite in history believes that it does not have sufficient power to work its will upon the world and supposedly to make the world a better place. They all seek more power. That's just part of the nature and tendency of man. The second step toward democide is the destruction of mechanisms of accountability. Now, I hope you'll forgive me if I commit the sin of political science this evening. I'll try to make it digestible and not all that tedious. I think it's important that we understand some of the basic predicates here of how mass murder takes place through governments. Mechanisms of accountability include such things as laws to which the governing class are accountable as well as those who are governed. One of the things that really took a beating during the Clinton era was the notion that everybody is ruled by the same laws. Mr. Clinton made a cottage industry out of saying that he could prevail upon a whole host of exemptions from the laws that govern the rest of us. As a matter of fact, that was a refrain that we heard incessantly for about 2.5 years that as long as the economy was chugging along, we really shouldn't be worried about whatever Mr. Clinton is doing in his private life. If that includes the serial commission of various felonies, so what? It's the economy, stupid. Don't worry about it. That's the destruction of accountability. That is a necessary step towards the type of a government that can commit democide. It's a government that is no longer ruled by law. Many of you are acquainted with Vladimir Lenin, who was the founder of the Soviet communist dictatorship in Russia. Vladimir Lenin is the most influential politician, most influential political philosopher of the 20th century, or so far the 21st. He was the apostle of the total state. Just about every state in the world, to a greater or lesser extent, unfortunately including our own national government, in some way or another is influenced by Lenin's writings, his practice, and example. Lenin defined his concept of dictatorship as follows. The scientific concept of dictatorship means nothing else than this: power without limit, resting directly upon force. You want to know what communism is? There it is in a nutshell. Throw Marx out the window. Dispense with all these obscure and confusing economic doctrines that nobody cares to read and doesn't believe in anyway. All it is power without limit, resting directly upon force. Now, Mussolini, who created the Italian fascist government, was a disciple of Lenin. That's a little-known fact about history. He was a communist who created his own variant of socialism called fascism. His formula was everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. That's the total state in practice. So those are the first two ingredients toward democide. The third is civilian disarmament. Don't let them call it gun control. One of the most insidious things that happens in the process that leads to the creation of the total state is psychological disarmament, which is to say our thoughts are re-engineered through the use of deceptive language and through the use of deceptive appeals to emotion. And one of the most insidious of these, I think, is the expression gun control. We're not talking about gun control. We're not talking about disarmament, universal disarmament, because the guns are not going to disappear. The weaponry is not going to be evaporated. What you will have instead is a monopoly on weaponry, a monopoly on the means of force. And civilians will be disarmed. So what's civilian disarmament? Anytime you hear somebody talking about gun control, make sure that you say something along the lines of, oh, you're referring to civilian disarmament then, aren't you? Make sure that we're talking in terms that are intelligible and actually describe what we're discussing. Use language that is descriptive and not deceptive. Now, the state cannot have total power if its subjects are armed. If its subjects are armed, they are in principle citizens and not subjects. And I'd like to examine that for just a second here. It is a principle in Western political thought that goes all the way back to ancient Greece, that an individual who can defend himself through the use of force, who can bear arms in defense of himself, his home, his community, his country, that is a citizen. You can go all the way back to ancient Greece and see that concept. One who has to depend upon others for that protection is a subject or a slave. That isn't to say that everybody who can bear arms must bear arms, although I think that that's a wise perspective in addressing this issue. It is to say if you are forbidden to bear arms in your own defense, if you are dependent upon somebody else to bear arms on your behalf, and you are forbidden to bear arms, you're a subject or a slave. Now, the Second Amendment is, I think, very widely misunderstood by people who support and protect and cherish the right to keep and bear arms. A lot of people think that that is our primary protection of this God-given right. I disagree. The primary protection that we have against threats from the central government to seize our weaponry is the Constitution itself, which does not grant that power to the central government. The fundamental premise of the Constitution is that only those powers specifically given to the central government can be exercised by the central government. If it isn't there, the central government cannot exercise the power in question. There's nothing in the Constitution that authorizes the central government to infringe the right to keep and bear arms. So what purpose does the Second Amendment serve? It serves a couple of very valuable ones. First of all, because of the Second Amendment, the national government cannot use a backdoor approach to disarming the citizenry of the United States. It cannot, for instance, say that because the federal government is given the power to regulate interstate commerce, that it can use this power to choke off the commerce in firearms. Why? Because it has that power except when it is forbidden by the Constitution to exercise it. The Second Amendment forbids it to do so. Ergo, it cannot use the Interstate Commerce Clause as a way of choking off the firearms trade. Not many people understand that. That's one very valuable purpose served by the Second Amendment. Another very valuable purpose served by the Second Amendment is to recognize that the states are supposed to have an armed body of citizens that is referred to as the militia, which in principle basically is the citizenry, except for public officials. This is a way of ensuring, once again, that you don't have this central consolidation of power, which is so dangerous and which can lead to such horrible tragedies as democide, the mass murder of people. And the third really valuable purpose served by the Second Amendment, I think, is that it serves as a tangible reminder and a warning that the American concept of government cannot embrace this notion that the government can have a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. If you go to a political science classroom, my background's in political science, chances are within the first week of a 100-level political science course, you're going to be told that government is that agency in society that can exercise a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. That's a totalitarian definition. If the state has a monopoly on the use of force, then it is following Lenin's prescription, power without limit, resting directly upon force. How many generations of American students have been raised to believe Lenin's definition of the state is the one that all decent people will embrace? Government is the entity that can exercise a monopoly on force? No. Take a look at the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment is tangible testimony that our founding fathers rejected that idea even before the advent of modern totalitarianism. And that leads us, I think, necessarily to review a couple of expressions on the part of our founding fathers of this philosophy. Alexander Hamilton and James Madison in the Federalist Papers made it very clear that the purpose of the armed citizenry was not just to protect our country against possible threats from foreign invaders. And that, by the way, is something we are seeing re-examined in the light of what happened to us on September 11th. Suddenly, those of us who said that an armed American citizenry can deter a foreign enemy are not looked upon as kooks. Now that we have seen that horrible body count from September 11th, when for the first time since the War of 1812 we had a foreign enemy slaughtering Americans on our own soil, suddenly people don't look at us as being quite so unreasonable when we say it's a good idea for Americans to be armed as a way of protecting us against possible foreign threats. But the founders, Hamilton, Madison, and others, understood that the preeminent source of potential injury to our rights and potential tyranny is our own central government. So Hamilton wrote as follows, and I quote, "If circumstances should at any time oblige the government to form an army of any magnitude, that army can never be formidable to the liberties of the people while there is a large body of citizens, little if at all inferior to them in discipline and the use of arms, who stand ready to defend their own rights and those of their fellow citizens. This appears to me the only substitute that can be devised for a standing army and the best possible security against it if it should exist." There is supposed to be a counterbalance on the part of the citizenry against the ambitions of a corrupt ruling elite that would use a standing army as an instrument of oppression. Noah Webster, of course, agreed with Hamilton and Madison and Mason and Washington and all the other founders who left written record of their views regarding the right to keep and bear arms. Noah Webster, of course, is the educator and statesman to whom we owe the English language, quite frankly. He was the one who created the lingua franca of the United States. This is what he had to say about the subject of the right to keep and bear arms. "Before a standing army can rule, the people must be disarmed as they are in almost every kingdom of Europe. The supreme power in America cannot enforce unjust laws by the sword because the whole body of the people are armed and constitute a force superior to any band of regular troops that can be on any pretense raised in the United States." That is the perspective that we should adopt when examining the right protected by the Second Amendment. The American concept is that the powers of the government are derivative, and they are irrevocable. If they are abused, we can take them back from the government. We've done that. As a matter of fact, that's why we're the United States of America instead of a colonial possession of Great Britain. Now, the United Nations, on the other hand, whose very name is a lie, the United Nations is not the United Nations, it is the United Regimes. I mean, the political entities represented in the General Assembly are not nations. Most of them are squalid little third world dictatorships that are run by thugs and terrorists. As a matter of fact, one of the real choking ironies about what's gone on since September 11th is the idea that we are now fighting a war on terrorism through the United Nations, which makes about as much sense, I guess, as a sheriff rounding up a posse of rustlers or seeking the services of the mafia to combat organized crime. The United Nations is terror central. It has always been and continues to be, at least as far as the General Assembly is concerned, a playpen for regimes that are not housebroken, that are controlled by terrorists. In any case, the UN embraces the totalitarian formula of government. Look at what the United Nations Charter says in its preamble. It defines its purpose as that of saving succeeding generations from the scourge of war. War is a terrible thing. War is less deadly than totalitarian government, however. They wish to save us from the scourge of war by inflicting upon the world the scourge of totalitarianism. This is not a good bargain. Second point, defining the UN's totalitarian philosophy. It has always embraced Lenin's view of government. Even a cursory review of the UN's literature will be sufficient to illustrate that the United Nations believes that governments were instituted to exercise complete power over the individual, and that rights are simply temporary concessions granted to the individual by the all-powerful government. As a matter of fact, if you look at that document that is called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, on numerous occasions and in numerous places in that document, there is specific recognition of the fact that none of the supposed rights which are enumerated in that document can be used in ways that are contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. Whenever communist China or dictatorships of that kidney are criticized for restricting or abolishing the practice of individual rights, they can invoke the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which makes it very clear that public order as defined by the state trumps the exercise of all rights. This just happened, as a matter of fact, 6 months ago, when China was being upbraided for imposing upon the religious liberties of its subjects. They invoked the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We're just upholding public order. And that's as far as the UN goes in terms of its supposed respect for human rights. I earlier quoted Lenin's definition of dictatorship as power without limit. It might interest you to know that in 1970, UN Secretary General U Thant, who was from Burma, he was also a Marxist. All of the UN Secretary Generals have been socialists of one variety or another. U Thant in 1970 said that Lenin was a man of great vision, and his vision of peace and peaceful coexistence was in harmony with the UN Charter. That's their vision of peace. That's how they would preserve us from the scourge of war. As trite as it sounds, and as hackneyed as it might appear, there is some wisdom in the saying that you cannot spell communism without UN. That's just the way these people think. The third point that illustrates the UN's totalitarian philosophy is that its treatment of the issue of what it calls small arms and light weapons. Small arms is a category which includes everything, including revolvers. It's a category which starts with knives and ends with howitzers, but it includes revolvers and all the weapons that we're likely to own as civilians. All of the UN's documents on this subject specify that civilians must be disarmed and that national governments must have a monopoly on the use of force. Now, the New American magazine, starting about 10 years ago, was warning people that the next big disarmament drive on the part of the UN would be civilian disarmament. Here's a principle that I think bears repeating and certainly should be remembered. In matters of disarmament, all roads eventually lead to the United Nations. It doesn't matter whether you're dealing with a gun control group that has no visible connection to the United Nations, the undertow of that movement will eventually carry them to the UN. That's certainly what happened with this group that calls itself the Million Mom March. They were very prominently represented in July at the UN's World Conference on Small Arms and Light Weapons. And just a few weeks before, they had been party to the creation of another group called the Billion Mom March for the same purpose, which is the psychological disarmament of the masses. But when we started warning about the UN's intention to disarm civilians worldwide, some people who fancy themselves experts on the supposed menace of what is called the radical right began to make mock of the John Birch Society. As a matter of fact, after the tragic Oklahoma City bombing of 1995, this became something of a growth stock. Suddenly these experts arose to talk about how Timothy McVeigh was supposedly a creation of the militia underground, which of course isn't true. Timothy McVeigh was a disgruntled former federal employee. They also talked about how the John Birch Society supposedly was the seedbed of the militia movement, which is not true as well. One fellow by the name of John J. Nutter from the Conflict Analysis Group in Ohio put on a program in Oklahoma City in April of 1996, 1 year after the Oklahoma City bombing, in which he talked about the typology of right-wing extremism. And in this seminar, which was taught for the benefit, I should say the supposed benefit, of law enforcement agents, police officers, he talked about how the John Birch Society was right at the center of the so-called radical right-wing movement. And he talked about a way of identifying extremists. It's interesting that you never hear about left-wing extremists. It's always right-wing extremists. Apparently you cannot be too extreme if you're on the left. And the political spectrum only runs from the center to the far right, and there is no left wing. But in order to understand whether you're dealing with an extremist, John J. Nutter was talking to police about how they had to look out for certain warning signs, such as, do they mention the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, the Illuminati? Do they cite the Articles of Confederation? Are they preoccupied with the 9th and 10th Amendments? Do they possess or receive the violence literature listed below? The violence literature, by the way, includes the New American magazine and my second book, Freedom on the Altar. But one of the things he said to this audience of law enforcement agents was that they should look for people who have Second Amendment bumper stickers on their cars as a way of determining whether you're dealing with a potential Timothy McVeigh. He also said that if you're dealing with somebody who believes that the United Nations presents a threat to the right to keep and bear arms, that's somebody you should keep a particularly close eye on, because that's definitely somebody who's going to detonate and do some real damage. And so when he delivered this seminar for law enforcement officers in Oklahoma City, there were several members of the John Birch Society who were in the audience. We have many, many, many thousands of law enforcement officers in our organization. And one of them very thoughtfully sent us a copy of the syllabus of the seminar that was taught by John J. Nutter. So I called up Dr. Nutter and said, hello, Dr. Nutter. My name is William Grigg. I'm a senior editor for the New American magazine and author of Freedom on the Altar. I would like to speak with you about your seminar on criminal justice and right-wing extremism in America. And there was a long, rather anguished pause on the other end of the line, and he said, how did you find out about that seminar? And I said, well, Dr. Nutter, surely you know we're everywhere. One of the subjects of our discussion was this idea that the United Nations posed a threat to firearms ownership. He said, where did people get the idea that the UN would come and get their guns? I said, well, Dr. Nutter, in the front courtyard of United Nations headquarters is a large statue depicting a Colt Python revolver with its barrel twisted into a knot. Where I come from, this is called a clue as to the intentions of the people who represent the United Nations and carry out their agenda. The United Nations is by no means coy or secretive about its intentions. What's just happened recently is that the rest of the public is caught up with what people who have read the UN literature have known for decades. In order to have general and complete disarmament, eventually you're going to have to disarm civilians. In order to have a monopoly on force, you're going to have to disarm civilians. And the literature that the UN puts out on that subject is very blunt. Last year, the UN put out a propaganda video called Armed to the Teeth, the Worldwide Plague of Small Arms. There's a good place to go if you're interested in seeing how proud the United Nations is of that abhorrent statue. It's called Disarmament. It was a gift of the government of Luxembourg in 1986. Luxembourg distinguished itself in World War II by being a very minor speed bump for the Wehrmacht. largely because their population was disarmed. In any case, that twisted barrel statue is on the cover of Armed to the Teeth. As a matter of fact, if you look at the UN's disarmament literature, that's a motif that shows it time and time again. They're very proud of it. This is something I call spiritual Tourette syndrome. Sometimes people just cannot suppress what's really going on, and eventually it'll come out. And that's the sort of thing that we're seeing here with this and with other elements of the UN symbology. And anybody, by the way, who disagrees with the notion that the UN is an occultic organization needs to take a look at their meditation room. That's on the cover of my second book, Freedom on the Altar, and it's one of the creepiest places I've ever been. And those who are agnostic about the fact that there's a spiritual dimension to the UN really ought to visit the UN headquarters, go to that room, take a look at the stained glass window display outside the entrance to the UN's meditation chamber, which is where, if my intelligence is correct, Kofi Annan married his current wife at the altar in the meditation room of the UN. This is some industrial strength weirdness that you can see at the UN headquarters. But back to the UN's video, Armed to the Teeth. Armed to the Teeth, the worldwide plague of small arms. This video is a really good example, once again, of this effort towards psychological disarmament. Let me just recite a couple of things that are said by the narrator in this video. Small arms are not fussy about the company they keep. They can murder indiscriminately. The gun that killed in Africa can do it again in Latin America or in Asia. Humankind is beginning a new millennium under the sign of the gun. Small arms are like uninvited guests who won't leave. Once they take over a country, they are virtually impossible to get rid of. This is what we call the sympathetic fallacy, where we assign independent malice to inanimate objects. Guns can't take over a country. Guns are tools. It's like saying hammers could take over a country. But the point here is to get embedded in the public mind the idea that guns are somehow innately evil, but only in the hands of civilians. That's a very important thing that not many people pay attention to. A little bit later on in Armed to the Teeth, the film describes legal weapons as those, quote, used by armies and police forces to protect us. Civilian-owned weapons, by way of contrast, are supposedly illegitimate and bring insecurity, pain, suffering, and devastation. And so in the interest of protecting us from genocide, which is one of the things that this documentary describes, we have to make sure that the only people who have firearms are members of the military and nationalized police forces, which are the very elements of society that carry out every genocide. Somebody's going to have to run the math on this proposition for me because it just does not make sense. Lloyd Axworthy, who's a former Canadian Minister of Justice and very active in the UN's drive for civilian disarmament, has made it clear, as have many other people in the UN's orbit, that it is necessary not only to have international controls on the illegal transfer of firearms, but we have to have international controls on legally owned firearms, because legally owned firearms in civilian hands are potentially illegal. This is how he explained this. It is not sufficient to limit the examination of the international firearms trade purely to the question of illegal transfers. There must be a connection and a serious way of looking at the legal transfers, because it is those legal transfers which end up being illegal and ending up in the wrong hands. The gun you own, even if you have paid for it, filled out all the paperwork, obeyed all the laws which are on the books, is potentially illegal. By the way, that's something that California gun owners have learned when they were made criminals after the fact, when the government decided that certain types of firearms were no longer going to be possessed by civilians. Same things happened in Canada, although the Canadians, who would have thought, are rebelling against it, and the same things happened in Australia and in Great Britain. Because they're owned by civilians, they're regarded as potentially illegal, and the objective is to get them out of civilian hands. The UN for the last 5 or 6 years has talked about a concept it calls human security. Prior to the mid-1990s, the UN, in spite of the fact that some of its literature implied that it eventually would deal with the concept of human security, the UN really didn't deal with the notion that it was the ultimate custodian of the security of individual humans. They believed that, or rather they led people to believe that the UN's perspective was that national governments are to be the custodians of individual well-being, which is bad enough. But starting with the publication of a report called Our Global Neighborhood in 1995, the UN has come out of the closet here, if you will, as the self-appointed custodian for the well-being of every human being on the planet. Our Global Neighborhood was published by the Commission on Global Governance, and once again, the name of that organization is a clue. Governance is what government does. They're talking about world government, although they try to persuade people that they are not. They are, in fact, talking about global government. Human security requires the disarmament of civilians, according to the Commission on Global Governance. I'm reading now from Our Global Neighborhood, this report published in 1995. Quote, militarization today not only involves governments spending more than necessary to build up their military arsenals, it has increasingly become a global societal phenomenon, as witnessed by the rampant acquisition and use of increasingly lethal weapons by civilians, whether individuals seeking a means of self-defense, street gangs, criminals, political opposition groups, or terrorist organizations, close quote. If you own a firearm, you know better than a terrorist. You know better than a drug dealer. You know better than a guerrilla. The point is, you're contributing to this problem of militarization, and in the interest of human security, you must be disarmed. Which is why the Commission on Global Governance says that militarization must be fought by the imposition of government measures, quote, intended to encourage the disarming of civilians. Once again, that's pretty clear. Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the UN and recent Nobel Peace Prize laureate, I will return to that theme in a minute or two, published a report last year called We the Peoples. It was his official report for the year 2000 for the United Nations. Controlling the proliferation of illicit, meaning civilian-owned, weapons is a necessary first step towards the non-proliferation of small arms. This is the important part. These weapons must be brought under the control of states, and states must be held responsible for their transfer. That's pretty clear. They're not talking, once again, about disposing of the firearms. They're not talking about doing away with this weaponry. They're talking about monopolizing them, first at the national level, under UN supervision, and ultimately, as we will discuss in just a minute, under direct UN ownership. There would be a worldwide monopoly on firearms under the UN schemes, and each national government would have a limited franchise therein. They would do this, once again, in the name of human security and peace. Now, like our federal government, the United Nations is the center of a huge constellation of quasi-private think tanks and other entities intended to give them deniability regarding certain policy objectives. What they will do is they will commission a study. They will tell the people who write the study the conclusions that they want to have vindicated. The study will come out. Lo and behold, the UN's conclusions have been validated, and they'll put those conclusions into practice. This is what they call consensus. You hear that quite a bit. The United Nations rules by consensus. That means that people who fundamentally agree about what they want to do to begin with get together and find out they agree, and they announce a consensus that will govern the rest of the world. It's the same sort of thing they did, by the way, in the Soviet Union, and the Soviet government could be very insistent toward those who rejected the consensus. They could be lobotomized, they could be thrown into the gulag, or they could be eliminated outright. Now, one of the UN's premier think tanks is an outfit called the Bonn International Center for Conversion. Every time the peacekeepers go, as they call the UN military, every time the peacekeepers go into a country to pacify it, the Bonn International Center for Conversion is in some capacity helping to plot the strategy of civilian arms collection and destruction. Sami Faltis is one of the major figures at the Bonn International Center for Conversion. This is what he has to say about the method whereby we're going to disarm civilians worldwide. Quote, experience suggests that before and during the period of collection, strong emphasis should be placed on voluntary compliance, positive incentives, and freedom from prosecution. However, it seems equally important to make it clear that after this period of amnesty, the laws governing the possession of arms by civilians will be fully and actively enforced. In other words, use the carrot first and the stick later, close quote. Sami Faltis and an American employee of the, an American advisor to the Bonn International Center for Conversion by the name of Dr. Edward J. Lawrence have spoken about the use of what they call gun buybacks and turn-ins as a means of disarming civilians. Have we seen that type of thing happening in the United States? These programs have proliferated since about 1993, And Dr. Lawrence, who also works for the UN Register of Conventional Arms, has pointed out that gun buybacks and turn-ins in the United States are a UN-approved method of what they call micro-disarmament. Micro-disarmament is another phrase you ought to remember. That means the disarmament of civilians. And so whenever you hear about a gun buyback or a gun turn-in program, that's the sort of thing the UN has in mind in terms of voluntary relinquishment of civilian-owned firearms. And then Sammy Faltis continues, quote, "A subtle mix of rewards and penalties is needed for a weapons program to succeed. Ultimately, the ownership of arms should not be left to the personal choice of individuals. The state needs to preserve its monopoly of the legitimate use of force. So sanctions against the illegal possession and use of arms are necessary and should be imposed. However, during a weapons collection program, an amnesty is needed, and the emphasis should be on voluntary compliance and positive incentives." Now, a little bit later on in the same document, Sammy Faltis acknowledges that gun buybacks and turn-ins do not disarm criminals. They do not disarm the type of people who are bent on genocide. So what's the purpose? The purpose is to reinforce in the public mind, once again, this idea that you have to get rid of the weapons if you want to have social tranquility. It's psychological disarmament. You know, it's often been said, and I don't know if I entirely agree with this, that a man cannot be enslaved whose mind is free. I don't know if that's true, but I do know that no prison is necessary to enslave a man whose mind has been imprisoned. And if we get to the point where, in spite of the fact that we still have a legal right to keep and bear arms, but we have allowed ourselves to be indoctrinated into the notion that it is bad and socially injurious for civilians to bear arms, then we will be just as much a subject population as we would be if the arms were taken from us by force. Some of you, as a matter of fact, most of you, I would imagine, are acquainted with a document that was promulgated in 1961 by John F. Kennedy, entitled Freedom from War, the United States Program for General and Complete Disarmament in a Peaceful World. The story of this document is fairly interesting. As is so often the case, the federal government distributed a rather large quantity of this document in 1961. And the Bird Society became aware of it and started to disseminate it of our own volition. And so the government stopped printing them. And so we photographically reproduced them, and now they're available to all and sundry. This remains the framework for our arms control policy, for the State Department and Defense Department's arms control policy. And it talks about a three-stage program whereby the United Nations would be given a monopoly on military force, while each government at the national level would be permitted to retain a centralized and nationalized internal security force. Now think of that in the light of what's happening right now. Our war on terrorism is an Article 7 action on the part of the United Nations. Article 7, Chapter 51. What it means is that the United Nations declared war on our behalf when President Bush did not see fit to ask Congress for a declaration of war. The Security Council passed the resolution, and we are working through the United Nations with respect to the foreign war against our terrorist enemies. In the meantime, we have a newly christened Office of Homeland Security, which is a central coordinator for all matters having to do with law enforcement and security with respect to terrorism. That's pretty much the program described in this document back in 1961, 40 years ago. It's at least one very good variation on it. The other thing I think is really interesting is that now we're dependent upon NATO to police our skies and our seacoasts. NATO is an affiliate of the United Nations. NATO was designed under Article 7, Chapter 51 of the United Nations Charter to be a regional organization for self-defense, collective self-defense. About a year ago, the John Birch Society Bulletin had an article in which we interviewed Ann Williamson, who is a very well-respected Wall Street analyst, and she predicted over a year ago that the time would come, and she was thinking over the next 5 or 6 years, that the United States would be dependent upon NATO to protect the homeland, to protect the United States homeland. I would not have believed it would only take about a year for that ominous prediction to come true. Once again, the idea is that the United Nations would have a globe-spanning peace force. Boy, there's a Soviet expression, peace force. And each nation would be permitted to have an internal security force that would be military in nature and directed by the central government. And today at the airports, I got sort of a foretaste of what that's going to be like, as I saw these khaki-clad soldiers manning checkpoints with automatic weapons. It's really quite an ominous development in the United States, and I think people don't understand what a watershed this is in our history as a nation. Now, what is not well understood about this document is that it talks about the supposed need for universal civilian disarmament. It does not use that expression in so many words, but let me quote to you what it does say. In the third stage of the Freedom from War plan, and I quote, states would retain only those forces, non-nuclear armaments, and establishments required for the purpose of maintaining internal order. They would also support and provide agreed manpower for a UN peace force. The manufacture of armaments would be prohibited except for those of agreed types and quantities to be used by the UN peace force and those required to maintain internal order. All other armaments would be destroyed or converted to peaceful purposes. Peaceful purposes meaning, of course, the suppression of any form of instability that might lead to conflict, such as, for instance, the legitimate expression of a desire to throw off a tyrannical government. That was a subject which was much discussed last June and July at the UN. The UN's Small Arms Conference was an exercise in choreography not unlike a professional wrestling match. There was a script, and there was a predetermined outcome, and in the course of heading toward that predetermined outcome, there were a few legitimate blows that were thrown and some injuries that were inflicted, but the outcome was pretty much predetermined. But one subject which was discussed at the UN Small Arms Conference was this idea of banning the possession of firearms or the transfer of firearms to non-state actors, meaning civilians. They didn't get that provision in the program of action ratified at that conference because it was added after the fact. But the point is, it's been discussed now, and now that it's been discussed, when we have another conference, a follow-up conference in 5 years, that's going to be right at the top of the agenda. And in the meantime, they'll have 5 years to indoctrinate and mobilize on behalf of that objective. And once again, this is all something which was foreshadowed 40 years ago in an official document generated by our own State Department. The history of this document is pretty interesting. Really, the progenitor of this document is Nikita Khrushchev. I can't go into the details right now because we're running out of time. But in another very important document created in 1962 called A World Effectively Controlled by the United Nations, and those who have access to the internet, go to getousout.org and you'll be able to find an online text of every word of this report. It was created by Lincoln P. Bloomfield of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology on a State Department contract. World Effectively Controlled by the United Nations speaks unblushingly of the idea of a world government under UN control. But he talks about the fact that this document, this official arms control proposal, more or less was inspired by Nikita Khrushchev's proposal in 1959. And over the course of 2 years, our State Department and the Soviet Foreign Ministry played sort of a long-distance call and response game in which this document was thrashed out as a way of trying to trump the Soviets' arms control proposals before the United Nations General Assembly. We got involved in a bidding war with the Soviet Union over who could devise the most totalitarian framework for world peace, and we won. Good for us. There are just a couple of things I'd like to share with you before trying to wrap up on a more optimistic note. I had mentioned earlier that Kofi Annan and the United Nations received the Nobel Peace Prize about a week and a half ago. Now, at the Appleton headquarters of the John Birch Society, there's a somewhat lame and threadbare but running gag. Whenever the Nobel Peace Prize winners are announced, we always say, oh, who would have thought he was a communist? Because there's sort of a dismal consistency here in terms of the people the Nobel Peace Prize Committee deem worthy of our esteem. And that's certainly the case with Kofi Annan. There were some people in the Balkans and in Africa who were not quite so amused by that selection. Relatives and survivors of various massacres that were conducted during the course of UN peacekeeping excursions in the Balkans, in Rwanda, in Central Africa. People had been led to believe that they could entrust their human security to the United Nations. People had allowed themselves to become disarmed because, after all, the forces of peace were in place now. We could confide in them to look out for our interests. As a matter of fact, one such group of people said that Kofi Annan must have won the Nobel Prize for genocide because he certainly didn't bring peace. It is really quite a remarkable feat of marketing that Kofi Annan is looked upon as the dignified, principled pillar of rectitude and symbol of world peace, given his bloody history when he was the head of the UN's peacekeeping division. That was his calling prior to becoming Secretary General. Kofi Annan has served a career almost entirely as a UN bureaucrat. He's never earned an honest paycheck. He has followed a Soviet-style career path. He has failed upwards through a bureaucracy. It's really only in a communist bureaucracy that you could do such a thing. There's an interesting contrast between Kofi Annan and a man by the name of Romeo Dallaire. Some of you might be acquainted with Romeo Dallaire. He's a Canadian officer who was the head of the UN peacekeeping mission to Rwanda in 1993 and 1994. He was in Rwanda when the genocide erupted in April of 1994. That killing frenzy eventually destroyed the lives of an estimated 1.1 million people in the course of about 104 days. Now, for simple killing efficiency, that's quite a remarkable feat when one considers that most of the people who were killed were hacked to death with machetes. Anybody who has used a machete, and I've never used a machete against a living target other than a tree or underbrush, anybody who's used a machete knows that that is hard work. It really takes a devoted expenditure of focused hatred to hack a human being to death with a machete. And hundreds of thousands of them were killed in Rwanda, and the rivers of Rwanda ran red with blood. They were choked with bloated bodies for 104 days. Romeo Dallaire was discovered in mid-June of 2000, huddled under a park bench in Quebec, in Canada. He was drunk, he was unshaven, he was wearing a t-shirt, and he was suicidal. And he blamed himself because he had warned his superiors at the United Nations in January of 1994 that the genocide was coming, and he wasn't allowed to do anything to stop it. Let me read just a couple of things that Romeo Dallaire has said in the aftermath of that horrible, horrible spectacle. He describes incidents in which troops under his command came upon chopped up but living men and women who were often left to bleed to death because almost 1/3 of the population in Rwanda was infected with AIDS, and nobody had any surgical gloves to protect them from the virus. Dallaire often found himself standing knee-deep in mutilated bodies, surrounded by the guttural moans of dying people, looking into the eyes of children bleeding to death with their wounds burning in the sun and being invaded by maggots and flies. I found myself walking through villages where the only sign of life was a goat or a chicken or a songbird, as all the people were dead, their bodies being eaten by voracious packs of wild dogs. He recalled dreams in which he waded waist-deep in bodies covered in blood. I am holding up my arms trying to get out. Each time it comes back, the scene is worse. I can hear the rustle of bodies, and I am afraid to move for fear of hurting someone. And even when he was awake, the images of this killing orgy would come back digitally clear and one at a time. They do not disappear over time, and your normal state becomes acute depression. There are many days in the past, and less so now, when I wish I had died there. He warned Kofi Annan in a fax dated January 11th, 1994, that the Hutu regime, the Hutu ethnic group, was in command of the Rwandan government at the time. The Hutu regime was registering the Tutsis for slaughter. He had been told by a defector from that government that they were registering the Tutsis and they were going to slaughter them systematically. And so he asked for permission to raid a government arms depot and to publicize to the world the plans for genocide. And he received a return fax from Kofi Annan instructing him that he was not to raid the government arms caches. You see, the UN doesn't disarm governments, it only disarms civilians. He was told to share his intelligence with the government that was planning the genocide, which was a green light. He was told that he was to tell them that they were aware of what was going on, but that the UN would not interfere. That's a green light for genocide, issued by Nobel laureate Kofi Annan. There was an official UN inquiry that later found that Kofi Annan was culpable for the genocide in Rwanda, that he had guilty foreknowledge of what would happen. Does that mean the UN should have gone in and forcibly disarmed the Rwandan government? Not necessarily. What it needed to do was let the world know. Let the world know, let the neighboring countries know, put them on notice as to what was going to happen, and from where I sit, it seems to me they should have allowed the civilians in Rwanda to arm themselves against the genocide. But instead, the UN was actually collecting weapons from those who eventually were slaughtered by the Hutu power regime in Rwanda. And by staying in Rwanda, the UN's peacekeepers actually enticed a number of people who otherwise would have fled to stay behind. You read just a couple of things that were said by survivors of the Rwandan genocide. Odette Nyiramilano, who is a genocide survivor, a nurse, a Tutsi nurse in Rwanda, said the following: "Really, it was the UN peacekeeping mission that tricked us into staying. We saw all these blue helmets, and we thought even if Hutus start to attack us, the 3,000 men of UNAMIR, that's the UN's peacekeeping mission, should be enough." Talk about misplaced trust. There's another survivor who, even as the massacre was going on, took refuge in a Catholic church in Kigali. This was her testimony as the genocide was taking place. They take them from this building, this church. They have guns and knives and machetes, the people from the government party, so we can't fight back. We don't have arms. That's pretty clear. Now, while it's true that most of the people who were killed in the genocide were hacked to death with farm implements that were sharpened to a killing edge, the people who had the farm implements and were actually doing the dirty work of killing were backed up by men who had automatic weapons that had been distributed to the militias by the government. These are government-run militias. These are the sort of standing armies that Hamilton warned us about. Jeffrey Boutwell and Michael T. Clare are people who work for the United Nations. They are supporters of civilian disarmament, but this is what they have to say about what happened in Rwanda. To outsiders, it appeared as if the people of Rwanda had been caught up in a violent frenzy with common farm implements as their favorite instruments of extermination, but this isn't the whole story. Before the killing began, the Hutu-dominated government had distributed automatic rifles and hand grenades to official militias and paramilitary gangs. It was this firepower that made the genocide possible. Militia members terrorized their victims with guns and grenades as they rounded them up for systematic slaughter with machetes and knives. The murderous use of farm tools may have seemed a medieval aberration, but the weapons and paramilitary gangs that facilitated the genocide were all too modern. They got one half of the equation right, but they didn't talk about the fact that the victims had been disarmed. The Wisconsin-based group Jews for the Preservation of Firearms Ownership did a detailed study of Rwanda's genocide, and they provided the other half of that equation. Quote, "The genocide regime's police and troops had government-issued firearms. The genocide regime also gave firearms and training to trusted civilians. In other cases, the regime issued to its supporters permits to buy firearms. The victims were not armed even though they knew they were at risk. They had previously been subject to smaller scale attacks. However, gun control laws enacted on 21st November 1964 and 7th May 1979 kept them from legally buying firearms for self-defense. Many had the money to do so, but despite Rwanda's general poverty, many members of the target group were the former political or current business elite. Almost all the intended victims of Rwanda's genocide regime tried to resist. They did not submit quietly to their murderers. The intended victims used stones, clubs, and improvised weapons. In literally a handful of cases, they used firearms taken from their would-be murderers. The survivor I quoted earlier was able to get out of the killing zone because her husband had an illegal firearm. He had a grenade. That family survived because they had not been disarmed. Everybody else who had been disarmed, of course, was another entry in the 20th century roster of democide. A couple of years ago, I contacted Professor Rummel and asked him if he was going to do a study of the Rwandan genocide in an updated version of Death by Government. He said, "No, I'm finished with that subject. I've had enough." It just seems that people are determined not to learn the obvious lessons of our tragic recent history. And one of those lessons is that if you want to wipe out a population, you have to target it, you have to demonize it, you have to disarm it, and then you can destroy it. And that has happened time and time and time again. And the UN's plan for human security is a perfect blueprint for that type of a democidal outcome. If the UN acquires the power that it seeks, and now for the first time in many, many years, the UN is in a position to claim that power because of what happened to our country on the 11th of September. If the UN obtains the power it seeks, it will have the ability to create a framework for Rwanda-style democide on a global basis. That is the logical outcome of its drive to disarm civilians worldwide. So how do we fight this? Well, their most important target is the territory between our ears, quite frankly. It is in the mind of men that the structures of violence are erected, so it is within the mind of men that the structures of peace must be constructed. That's one of UNESCO's catchphrases. They talk about creating a global culture of peace by persuading us that we should surrender our firearms and entrust them with our well-being. Well, they're on to something. If we're going to be free, we have to be informed. If we're going to have an impact in our political environment, we have to inform and mobilize others. It's not enough merely to be very well informed. Good heavens, I don't doubt for a second that there were many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or even millions of extremely well-informed people who ended up in Russia's Gulag or who were sent to the extermination camps in Nazi Germany. You have to be informed, you have to be motivated, you have to be mobilized, you have to follow a cohesive game plan. What the John Birch Society offers is a way to help Americans do the work of preserving their freedom. Citizenship is an active proposition. It's not passive. You cannot be a consumer-oriented citizen. You can be a subject and be passive. You can absorb what you are fed by the mainstream media and recite it with passionate conviction, and you can be a perfectly subdued subject. But to be a citizen, you have to be well-informed, you have to be mobilized, you have to follow a principle-based plan. One of the things that the John Birch Society is trying to do, as Hal alluded to at the beginning of this presentation, is get copies of my pocketbook, Global Gun Grab, the United Nations Campaign to Disarm Americans, into the hands of as many American gun owners as we possibly can. I am a gun owner. That is not one of my principal avocations. I'm a gun owner because I believe that's a dimension of citizenship. I'm not a gun enthusiast. I do like guns, but I really don't know a whole lot about them technically. But I do know the role that civilian gun ownership plays in a free society. Now, there are many millions of people who are gun owners. There are something like 160 million gun owners in this country. It's one reason why there's some semblance of freedom left, quite frankly. It's because there are over 160 million gun owners, of which we have reckoning. There are an estimated 300 million guns in our country. That was a subject of some discussion at the UN in July, some very disappointed and aggrieved discussion I can certify. Think of the number of people who need to know what the United Nations has in store for them if they allow themselves to be disarmed psychologically and eventually to be disarmed physically. This is a small and hopefully very digestible book. It was written to be accessible. When I brought it home after the first print run was finished, I showed it to my wife, Corinne, and she looked at that and she said, I could read that. That's the reaction we're trying to provoke, quite frankly, is I could read that. And it makes a good stocking stuffer, too. It's just the right size. But it's not enough to read. There is a whole arsenal of educational weapons that we have as part of our new campaign to get us out of the United Nations. Quite frankly, the timing of this campaign is almost miraculous. We were just ready to go, ready to roll out our first deployments in our campaign against the United Nations when Black September happened. And suddenly people were asking, why are you talking about the UN after this modern Pearl Harbor attack? And we said, just wait. Wait just a few days and watch how the UN capitalizes upon it. And sure enough, within 2 days, the UN had appointed itself our global anti-terrorism police. And suddenly, with the Nobel Peace Prize award and with polls that say something on the order of 63% of the American public support having the UN fight our war on terrorism, suddenly this campaign takes on a new and unprecedented urgency. So if you're not involved in our campaign to get us out of the UN, please look into enlisting. We desperately need your help. Your country needs your help because, quite frankly, right now is the time to leave it all on the battlefield. You've probably heard how in football or basketball games, commentators will say, well, it looks like they're leaving it all on the court, or it looks like they're leaving it all on the field. They're not holding back. There is no tomorrow. You know the whole procession of cliches. Well, they apply right now. We need to leave it all on the battlefield because if what is happening right now follows its logical path to consummation, we will be in a situation where the UN will achieve its long-sought monopoly on firearms, its world-spanning peace force. We will be living in a garrison state. Oh, it'll be a pretty one. No doubt we'll still enjoy most of the consumer amenities that we've come to depend upon so much, but we won't be free. I don't want to live in a country like that. I don't think any of you do either. So please look into enlisting in our campaign to get the United States out of the UN, and look as well into other aspects of the John Birch Society program. I want to finish with something I find very inspiring. Some of you are acquainted with the fact that Switzerland, a landlocked and rather small country, is a nation devoted to the notion that civilians should bear arms in defense of the Commonwealth, and that for hundreds of years, with the exception of a few years during the Napoleonic era, Switzerland has been free and independent. They're a multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-religious society with a limited government, and they mind their own business with admirable fidelity. And for some reason, they have never been called upon to undergo the trauma of a terrorist attack. I think that there's some wisdom in that example. In 1940, it looked as if Switzerland was going to lose its heritage of freedom because there was a very plausible threat from Germany after the fall of France. It looked like Switzerland was next on the menu. And it looked as if the central government was going to capitulate. And it might well have capitulated and done what so many other governments did, which was simply surrender to Hitler that which he could not have taken by force. And it might have done so had it not been for General Henri Guisan, who was the head of the Swiss militia. Switzerland does not have a general in peacetime. They only appoint a general to their army or militia when it looks as if they're going to go to war. General Henri Guisan summoned 600 of his ranking officers to Rütli Meadow, which is where the Swiss government, the Swiss Confederation, was formed in August of 1291. And he told his top leadership echelons that their country was in immediate mortal peril. And then he delivered this remarkable speech. If by radio, leaflets, or other media any information is transmitted doubting the will of the Federal Council or of the Army High Command to resist an attacker, this information must be regarded as lies of enemy propaganda. Our country will resist aggression with all means in its power and to the bitter end. Everywhere where the order is to hold, it is the duty of conscience of each fighter, even if he depends on himself alone, to fight at his assigned position. That's the citizen soldier in action. The riflemen, if overtaken or surrounded, must fight in their position until no more ammunition exists. Then cold steel is next. As long as a man has another cartridge or hand weapon, he does not yield. Here, soldiers of 1940, we will inspire ourselves with the lesson and spirit of the past to hear the mysterious call that pervades this meadow. To defeatist propaganda, everyone should oppose the spirit which animated the mountain folk who in 1291, when left to themselves, placed their confidence in themselves and in God. Thus will the country be strong and the army quite ready. One order is ample, hold fast. The leaders knelt in prayer and then they rose to work. They organized the National Redoubt, which was a series of fortifications beckoning the Nazi army, if they invaded, to follow the Swiss army up into the mountains and root them out. And the Nazis took a look at an army that was an armed citizen population, an entire nation under arms. They looked at Switzerland. They measured the Swiss resolve. They decided they didn't want any part of that. And so they left Switzerland alone. And so General Guisan died in 1961 in a free and independent Switzerland. We can do the same. That's not the first time that Switzerland was threatened with invasion from Germany. During World War I, an emissary of the Kaiser was he invited himself actually, to Switzerland to inspect the Swiss border fortifications. This, of course, was a Junker. He was a member of the Prussian military aristocracy. He believed that you could only have a good military if it was a professional, state-run military, and so he was somewhat contemptuous of the Swiss militia. And after touring the Swiss border fortifications, he looked at the militiamen with an air of haughty disdain and said, "You Swiss are so proud of your 250,000-man citizen militia. Tell me, what will you do if tomorrow 500,000 German soldiers come over your border?" And the militiamen said, "That's easy. Each of us will shoot twice and go home." Thank you very much for listening to me this evening.
After we wrap up, you can, if you have any questions for Mr. Grigg, you can ask him over the table as he autographs your book. Just let me make a couple of recommendations, for specific recommendations. First off, if you're not a member of the Birch Society, you should join tonight. Not think about it, consider it, but do it. Second off, put your name on a mailing list. If you want to host, get us out of the UN committee, start your own committee. We'll talk to you about it. Ed Sargent, Ed, can you put your hand up? Ed, by the way, is a volunteer coordinator, and he's one of the guys that's helping to organize these committees. Talk to me, talk to Bill McNally, who's around somewhere, if you're interested in hosting a meeting in your home or a local library. We have petitions that you can take at the table. Don't just get people to sign them, get the people who sign them to get others to sign them. Okay? Will Grigg's book, don't get one copy. We only have about 50 copies here, but get a caseload. You get a good discount, and you can talk to us about that as well. Most of you here are gun owners and gun enthusiasts. Get your like-minded friends involved in this campaign as well. Get them to sign the petition. To get a little more detailed understanding, the United Nations Exposed. Good material. And of course, UN Starter Kit. All this is available at the table. And a coffee can was passed around. That's to cover the expenses, and which is quite a bit, by the way. So if you haven't helped out, please put something in there. I want to thank you all, and God bless.